All right. Welcome to another podcast with Subtunnel. And today we have a special guest, and his name is Seamus McKim. He's a marine biologist. Seamus, how's things?
Not too bad at all. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Gotta spice up the podcast once in a while. You know what I mean? Gotta keep it real. Gotta have guests all the time.
Happy to be here.
Cool. So it's been a while since I did this. It's like months. I actually did a sort of podcast with somebody else. So this has been a while. So it's kind of rusty on around the edges. Trying to set up the audio feed and all the stuff like that. But it's coming right. So tell me about you. What do you do? What kind of work you're into, and where are you based?
Where am I based? I'm based in Edinburgh, actually. Surprise, surprise.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I work for a company which provides certification for, amongst other things, MSC fisheries. So I'm a kind of consultant.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. That's pretty cool. So your job takes you all over the country and stuff like that, does it?
Yeah, and hopefully eventually the world.
Wow.
I'm working very hard with fisheries, but I also have a better than average understanding of aquaculture as well. So fish farming, salmon and trout, and new things like prawns and shrimp out in the Far East.
Oh, right. Cool. So have you spent a lot of time in the Far East?
I lived in Japan for nearly 3 years when I was a young man.
Right.
But
cool.
no, that's good.
Okay, cool. So, what was Japan like? What was it?
Where do I start? I mean, it's a pretty big country actually. In the sense that it's quite a small geographical unit.
Right.
But just in terms of what's there, it's just bonkers. I moved from Villa Lewis to Tokyo, which has a population of about 30 million.
Oh, right. Okay.
So it's a bit of a change, bearing in mind it's 5 or 6 times the population of Scotland as a whole. So
whoa, that's pretty interesting.
yeah, and it's all in one city, and it was fantastic. But culture shock is something that is often mentioned in the same breath.
I heard a lot about people who went to Japan. They find it quite a very different place from the rest of Asia in terms of culture and different customs and values.
Yeah. I mean, certainly from what I'm used to, I'm used to a very conservative kind of, very religious kind of. Where I grew up was like that, and when I moved to Japan, it was immediately very different. You have this kind of constant clash between the old and the new, and I've never been anywhere like it in that sense. It's very interesting, kind of, that they maintain a very traditional society based on kind of feudal rules and regulations that aren't necessarily that obvious to the casual observer, but they're also, they're technologically pretty much at the top of the tree. I mean, they're way up there, and generally whatever is in this country has been out there for a couple of years.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, and what were you specializing in while you were in Japan? Well, what kind of projects were you doing?
I was the recipient of a government scholarship, so the Japanese government paid for me to be there. I got very lucky. They were very, very generous. They paid for me to basically study. I was a research associate at the Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology, which is quite a prestigious
that's pretty
university.
Good. Oh, right.
And I was studying. This is where we probably lose the audience.
No, go ahead, man.
We're studying the visual function in pelagic fish, so fish that live in the sea.
Right.
In Japan and in certain other countries in the Far East, they use light to manipulate fish, whether they get them to move towards the light or away from the light.
Okay.
They use that as a kind of basis of capture method, so a way of catching fish.
Right.
And I was trying to understand that process.
That's pretty interesting. And you do learn. It was it like research, or was it like an actual application to it? Like
both. I mean, it was kind of interesting in that it had definite sort of academic kind of knowledge for the sake of knowledge kind of research, but also it was very closely related to the fishing industry in Japan. So you had a kind of ultimate goal, which was to link it to industry.
Okay.
But I mean, it satisfied that need for me. I think I'll always be a student. I love learning about stuff. Whatever it may be, it just so happens that I'm really interested in marine biology and the way fish see. But no, I mean, it had a direct knock-on and influence on the way that fishing gear was designed, and that's partly where my funding came from. It came from the fishing industry.
Right. Oh, that's pretty interesting, yeah. And I mean, the last time we talked briefly, you were mentioning something about some diseases that are quite common in fish, which cause a degradation of the muscles and makes them unable to move and stuff like that.
So when I came back from Japan, it was just sort of maybe getting over 10 years, and it makes me sound really old. About 10 years ago, I returned, and unbeknownst to me, the UK was in the middle of the credit crunch, and there weren't any jobs. So I ended up working back home for a fish farming company that were farming salmon in the Western Isles. It's still a big thing, and it's kind of unavoidable. It's a big employer back home. I became, long story short, is I became involved in fish farming, which I hadn't up until that point done. I'd always kind of seen it as a bad thing, and a lot of the people that I graduated with in my undergrad degree, they kind of saw me as the bad guy, the kind of black sheep, because I was a bit of a Judas, because I ended up working for people that were, at the time, probably not seen in a very good light, and generally the perception is that fish farmers are destroying, the environment, which to a certain extent is actually true, but it's a very, very small percentage, and that's a whole different conversation. But I got involved in fish farming, and I decided that I wanted to do a bit more learning, so I went back to university.
Right.
There is a point to this. I'm getting there.
Okay.
So for my master's thesis, I was actually doing a master's in fisheries ecology, so much more linked to what I'm doing now. But for my thesis, I ended up these in salmon.
Okay.
So I was looking at kind of immune function on a genetic level. So I was doing PCR techniques, that's called chain reaction, which is quite high level stuff. I was working in the lab a lot, and it was a bit more removed than I'm used to from being outside in the environment, which is definitely something that I really like doing. So, it was fantastic. So I was working with salmon, and I was trying to work out why salmon that perhaps survive infection.
Right.
It's noted that even if they survive their growth curves, so the amount of weight that they're putting on in a given period of time is perhaps not as good as you would normally expect. And my question was, and that's what all research is about, is answering questions. My question was, is there a genetic basis for that relationship? I was looking at genes involved in building up and breaking down of muscle tissue, which is used as a measurement technique for how well the fish is growing. And obviously in fish farming you have a constant kind of juggling, or rather a balancing act of how much stuff you put into how much stuff you get out.
Right.
Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, I know. So that's a lot of work and that goes into this, and you got to take a lot of readings and calculate lots of other variables.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty interesting stuff. Any new discoveries lately in terms of new parasites or any sort of new organisms causing fish to develop any new sort of disabilities?
There's not really much that's new. I mean, but interestingly, as environmental kind of parameters are kind of changing on a kind of year-on-year basis, so
Yeah.
global warming, etc. Things that are perhaps one good example is something called AGD, which is a real challenge to the industry. Is it's in the water anyway. It's there and you can't avoid it. It's just that at a certain break point, at a certain threshold temperature, it becomes a problem. It proliferates rapidly, and what it does is it causes kind of clumping of tissue in the gills of fish.
Right.
And long story short is that eventually, and unchecked, it will suffocate the fish because they're no longer able to absorb oxygen from the water.
Right.
So as kind of global temperatures increase, that's only ever going to become a bigger problem. And obviously, for salmon, it's for farming salmon. There are certain places in the world where that works best. So you have kind of Norway, Chile, Canada, New Zealand, all very similar. They're all temperate climates, and in Tasmania especially, which is where it really started, they have slightly elevated temperatures in the ambient sort of water.
All right.
And they're having huge problems with AGD, and I think it's only a matter of time before Scotland has the same problems. And we're talking like fractional kind of differences here.
Right.
We're talking,
So is this like caused with the temperature, like the increase in temperature in the water causes this to get expand, like get worse?
Absolutely. So as I say, it's in the water anyway. You can't avoid it.
Right.
But when certain environmental kind of conditions are met, it just kind of, and I'm making it sound as if it's conscious of the decision it's making. It's not really conscious at all. It's just that when it's like a virus. When certain conditions are met, it will just bloom. It will grow exponentially, and it's trying to keep a handle on that. And like I say, I think it's only going to become a bigger factor. The company I worked for, which shall remain anonymous, started encountering significant losses. Sort of.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And when you're talking about significant losses, I mean you're talking off the top of my head, the cages, the pens that we were working with, so where the salmon was grown in the marine phase of its life. You're talking maybe 20,000 fish with a.
Wow, that's like lots of the money. That's millions of pounds, is it?
Yeah, I mean you've got maybe 14 cages per site, and each cage could potentially, with secondary processing, you're talking £400,000 or £500,000 per cage, and you might have a big salmon farming company might have 10 sites.
Wow.
10 cages, 10 sites, 100 cages. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that these, even a 5% loss, 10% loss increased on what is to be accepted. So normally you expect the same as terrestrial farming, it's the same as farming cows or pigs or sheep. You accept that you will lose a percentage, 5, 10, 20%. But when you're kind of losing 50% of your biomass, it's going to put you out of business in simple terms.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah. So at the moment, is a lot of threat out there to the fish farms. Is it like increasing with the rate at which pollution is starting to affect the water?
It's very tightly controlled in Scotland, especially. It's very tightly controlled. Scotland, coupled with Norway, were really the progenitors, the parents of certainly salmon farming, which is the dominant one in the Western world.
Right.
Well, sorry, I'll qualify that. In Europe, it's the dominant farmed species. In the Far East, certainly not, and they have a much much longer history of fish farming, but that's a whole different rabbit hole, which I'm not going to go down.
Right.
So
Okay.
if we deal with my kind of field of expertise, which is salmonids, which is the Atlantic salmon,
Right.
it's very tightly controlled. You have your farms in very carefully chosen locations where, through prevailing wind, tide, weather patterns, the amount of water going in and out, effectively, I'll use the word flushing. It makes it sound a bit odd.
Right.
But you have a constant throughput of very, very clean water. So these are places where the water is constantly kind of moving. It's not like farming in a lake, where you have stuff goes in and then can't really get out. So the marine phase, which is the greater proportion of a farmed salmon's life, you're talking maybe 15, 16 to maybe 20 months in the sea beyond its freshwater phase.
Wow.
It's very tightly controlled. Pollution is at a minimal level. Historically, sort of 20, 30 years ago, it was a bit like the Wild West, a bit of a cowboy industry where people were just having a go. They were building farms out of wood and all sorts of sort of substandard materials. It's now very tightly controlled. You have companies making with bespoke solutions, shall we say. There's a couple of kind of salmon orientated companies that are making all the kind of nuts and bolts, so the cages, the feed platforms,
right,
the boats.
Yeah.
And we're in much better shape. It's a common kind of misconception that it's poorly managed. It's actually probably better managed than farming on land. It's
right.
just
now, when talk about farming platform or feeding platforms, what goes into the feed? They're injected with hormones of some sort, or what? Some certain chemicals to enhance.
Depends. I mean, it depends entirely on the company involved. Most companies have their own suppliers. Some really big companies have their own in-house feed manufacturing plant. There's in fact, it's the largest fish farming company in the world, and it's present in all the places I mentioned earlier. They have just built a brand new plant in Skye, so that's very close to where I live.
Okay.
Or where I'm from. And they make their own food. There is a very pronounced shift, certainly in the last 10 years, towards it's this buzzword which is used in so many kind of industries now. Sustainability is absolutely everything. Sustainable fisheries, sustainable aquaculture, sustainable literally anything that's done now, anything that involves, well, anything really. I mean, you have sustainable procurement of any resource.
Right.
That's probably the best way I could say that.
Yeah. So how much does the government invest into these projects?
Well, I mean, it's all private sector, so the government doesn't really invest any money.
Right. Okay.
Except in perhaps the regulation.
Right.
There are a lot of regulations. In fish farming especially, you have the involvement with the Crown Estate. There are a lot of rules governing how land is owned in the UK. And I'm really, when I say the UK, I'm really talking about Scotland. There's not much fish farming in England that's based in the marine environment. There is a shift towards farming of mussels, but that's something completely different again. And there's also a kind of historical farming of rainbow trout, which are obviously freshwater. But in Scotland, you have the involvement with the Crown Estate. You have various NGOs and quangos. So that's quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations.
Right.
But in terms of what the government actually does and what they pay for, not a great deal. It's mostly to do with the regulation. Because it's all private sector, you have the investment of a lot of companies that aren't actually based in the UK. There's a couple in Norway. There's some American involvement as well. Mostly up in the very far north in the Shetlands and the Orkneys. But they do. The Scottish government does keep a very close check on what's going on, because it's obviously within the public domain. There's been a shift towards increased transparency, whereby you have stakeholder involvement. So if you were a landowner or a fisherman, and this is quite often a point of contention, especially with sort of fishermen and people that are using the same area. So you have recreational and kind of tourist trade as well involved. So say a fish farm wants to build a new site, and they want to put in 10 cages into a certain location. It has to go through a very long and very comprehensive process of approval. They can't just go out and say, I'm going to build a fish farm anywhere they want. It's a very well thought out process behind that. Usually what happens is the company involved will pay for their own study, where they think, and they're meeting lots of criteria, such as as I mentioned earlier, the flushing, and if it's good throughput of water, if the current is strong, that means the fish are swimming, which means it's developing muscle mass, they're putting on weight. But obviously, if you have lots of current, it tends to involve lots of weather, and be perhaps an exposed site. And then you have to kind of knock on to the, how do you ensure that humans that are working on these sites are going to be able to get out to the cages? Because if it's hugely exposed, and there have been many sort of instances worldwide where salmon cages are broken, and one of the great risks involved with farming anything like that is what happens if it all gets out. What happens if the cage breaks and all of the 20,000 salmon that you just finished farming get out into nature, and then you have the interaction with wild stocks. And
that's right. Yeah.
People are terribly worried about that, and when it gets into the media, there's often a bit of a panic.
So what does happen if, say, they get loose and they breed with the wild salmon? How does that?
It's a very good question, and it's been asked many times over. There's been a lot of money spent on studies where you have a massive influx of in genetic terms. There is a very strong tendency for selective breeding. So when you're putting I hasten to add that the same exists for pigs and sheep and cows. Over time, you breed for certain characteristics, whether it be resistance to disease, or that they grow fast, or that they are particularly resistant to environmental change. That kind of simplistic approach to genetic control, which is basically forced natural selection. But there's been a move towards kind of like, and this is where the public tends to panic, is when you start manipulating genes. So as I say, the big worry is that you introduce a population of fish which are by now pretty similar genetically speaking. There's not the diversity that exists in the natural environment. They're all generally, like I say, pretty similar. What tends to happen is that they are usually at a disadvantage because they are not fed, 5 times a day. So a lot will die very quickly because they're used to certain other conditions. I mean, this is a very long conversation, and I think I'd probably bore you to death by explaining all of it.
No, go ahead, man. Go, shoot. I got all the time in the world.
Well, suffice to say that there's a lot of risk involved there, and that's my personal opinion. But I think that it's being handled in a very comprehensive way.
Okay.
I don't think that there's a a panacea. I don't think there's a kind of cure-all or an answer for it immediately. But one thing which I will mention is the production of triploid fish. So without going into huge detail again, because for anybody other than me or anybody so closely involved, it's not that interesting.
Yeah.
Triploid fish are genetically incapable on paper. A bit like, think Jurassic Park. Now, you might have to think about that a wee while, because it's quite a long time ago. In Jurassic Park, they resurrected dinosaurs, and as a control method to stop them, sort of breeding and taking over the world again.
Yeah, that's right. You don't want the crazy mutant fish going around.
No. Yeah, so they made them genetically sterile.
Right. Okay.
So they were unable to reproduce naturally. So once they got out into the environment, they could, well, to be blunt, they could have as much sex as they wanted, and no babies would come of it.
Oh, right. Okay.
And that was at the genetic level. It was supposed to be hard coded into their their biological makeup beyond behavioral aspects or the fact that they were fenced off or removed from if I think in Jurassic Park they were all females, or they were all supposed to be females, but they made a mistake, as humans tend to, which was that they used they didn't have all they didn't have a complete genome.
Right. Okay.
So they substituted the parts they didn't have with stuff that they did, and it just so happened that I think it was a toad or a frog or something that could change sex. So they ended up with both males and females, and that was the problem. But triploid fish, it doesn't matter whether they are males or females; they can't
incapable of producing and reproduction. Right?
They will produce eggs and they will produce sperm, but it's just not going to happen. The machinery is not there for them to produce viable offspring. So even if an egg was fertilized, it just wouldn't kind of go anywhere. And there's been a lot of money invested in the production of salmon that are incapable of breeding. So even if in no way is it acceptable for farmed species to be to escape into the natural environment. Nobody wants that to happen. For the farmers, it's a huge loss of money. You imagine you've just lost 20,000 fish. Bearing in mind what I've said about how valuable these fish are.
Yeah.
You don't want it to happen, but the contingency plan, if things do go wrong, and they do. There was an instance recently in Chile where you had a mass escape. I think they lost about I think it was an incredible number, like 650,000 fish.
Whoa, that's a lot.
And they were not far off harvest size, so they were between 3 and 4 kilos in weight.
Yeah.
That's like it's the worst case scenario, is that you get to almost the end of the production cycle when you're thinking about taking all the fish out and killing them and selling them and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
You really don't want to have an escape at that point. It's the worst point, but it happens, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that triploid fish is at least an answer. I'm not gonna say that it is the best answer, but I think what I'm trying to say is that the fish farming industry is not where it once was. It's come a long way in a very, very short period of time. Think about it this way: farming of stuff on land has been taking place for. I don't even need to tell you. This is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Caveman would eventually have worked out that he could domesticate certain animals, and then you have cows and sheep and everything that we consider completely normal. That has had an evolution across centuries, if not multiple millennia.
Right.
Fish farming in the West has been squashed into, since its advent, and I'm talking more about salmon here, say the 1970s. It was happening slightly before that, but the 70s to now, it's 40, 50 years. That's not very good mathematics, but anyway.
Yeah.
All of that development has happened very, very short space of time.
Right.
So it's not really any wonder that problems do exist.
Yeah.
That's not to say that they can't be fixed, but consider it to when it compared with farming on land, we have centuries to iron out all these problems. And the way that technology is, you've got social media and all the rest of it. It's made it very difficult for aquaculture to be publicly acceptable. A lot of people are very negative.
Yeah. Okay.
And to be honest, I was for a long time. I went to university when I was 17, and I went away thinking, I'll never work in aquaculture. It's terrible. It's destroying the environment. The company I work for, this is a bit of a plug for the company I work for. Okay. What we do is we provide certification for lots of things, actually. The company as a whole provides certification for every aspect of farming, also processing facilities, work for the BRC, which is the British Retail Consortium. So they have, it's all based around standards. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve the way that certain industries work, and by certain industries I mean food-orientated industries, which is our specialization. So my experience is with capture fisheries, so wild fisheries, but also aquaculture. For aquaculture, you have a lot of companies which have decided that they want to you're really putting me on the spot.
It's all right, no pressure, man.
Well,
no pressure.
It's all to do with trying to I'll correct myself, actually. Part of it is trying to convince the public that the way that the industry is run is responsible and it's sustainable, ultimately. So you have, let's pick an example, ASC aquaculture is a standard which is based around certain principles. You have, and these are the core principles. One is obviously sustainability, as I've said. So anyway, what was I was trying to explain the certification process. So it's centered around standards. So we have what's called a standard holder. An example would be ASC. ASC is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council.
Right.
And they basically create a rule book, and they say that if you want to carry our logo, which is what the public see, you need to do certain things. And what we're going to do is design a set of rules, and then we're going to have somebody from what's called a certification body, which is an example of who I work for.
Right.
I work for a certification body, and what we do is we send out either a team or an auditor, and we make sure that farm, that production facility, is sticking to the rule book that's created.
Right. Okay. So you got to keep tabs on them. You got to do checks on them. Yeah.
And this is probably going to be slightly insulting, but the easiest way I can explain this is if you go into a supermarket. My local supermarket is Aldi. I don't mind dropping that name. It's a fine establishment. If you go to the fish or the meat counter and you pick up a packet, chances are it'll have some form of logo on it. It'll have, in Scotland, you'll have things like Quality Meat Scotland, or if you are buying frozen fish. And actually, Aldi and Lidl are good examples because of their ownership. They're a German company. They're very keen on sustainability, so they often carry logos, and by logo I mean the standard, that are kind of promoting that. You will have seen, no doubt, I guarantee you will have seen it, even if you weren't aware of it, a little blue triangle on fish. Now the little blue triangle is the logo for MSC, which as opposed to ASC, which is for aquaculture, MSC is for fisheries. And what that does is it gives the public something that they look for. It's quality assurance. It's you're perhaps buying, it'll go down to a tin of tuna. You pick up a tin of tuna, and I guarantee you it'll have something on it. It'll have maybe pollen line qualified, which is a non-accredited scheme, so it's not. Oh, this is where we get really complicated. I'll stick with MSC Fisheries. So you'll see the little blue triangle. Yeah, but I mean, there's loads and loads of them.
Oh, right.
And they all do slightly different things. Some are really high level, so that, and by high level I mean that the process of getting that logo is really complicated and really comprehensive. Some are at the other end of the scale, and you have lots of kind of factors affecting that. So something at the lower end of the scale, and it's in no way an indicator of the professionalism of the people involved. It's perhaps that to get that logo you have to do a one-day audit, and they will look at certain things, not in as quite not perhaps in as much detail as a more comprehensive study, and then you have all the kind of knock-ons like cost. So it costs more to get a more comprehensive, but if it's more comprehensive, you would be selling maybe to Marks and Spencers or Waitrose.
Right. Okay.
So you have that kind of costing structure internally. But basically, what I'm trying to say is, aquaculture and fisheries are now being squarely aimed at making the customer happy to perhaps pay a little bit more, because they think that they are doing the right thing. They're doing the ethical thing, which is good.
Right. Well, when you say ethical, it's not exactly 100% ethical, is it?
It depends on how you view ethics in food production.
Right.
And that's part of a larger question, which I'm not even going to attempt to go into.
Yeah.
So if let's just say that you're not a vegetarian, because that's down a different avenue. You want to be sure that when you go into a shop, that what you're buying is sustainable, that it's humane, you're not making animals suffer, and the public as a whole likes to believe that that's the way things are. And what certification bodies are, what the company I work for try to do is to give that, so that when they go in, they can look very, very simply, without going into reading of tons and tons of reports.
Yeah.
They can look at that packet of fish and they can say, oh, it's MSC approved.
Yeah.
There's a as robust as it can be likelihood that is exactly what it says it is. It stands for making sure that and this is for fisheries.
Yeah.
It's based around three broad principles. The first of which is that the stock is at a level which is appropriate to the exploitation involved. That the second is that the environment and the ecosystem that fish comes from is not adversely affected by the removal of that species. So you are harvesting, you're taking herring out of the North Sea. Your immediate concern is that the stock level of that species is at a level which can support the level of exploitation. So the amount you're taking out is immediately offset by the amount that is recruited year on year. So that's your kind of stock. But then you would have, perhaps, if you were removing X amount of herring from an ecosystem, what would be the knock-on the food web? So if you took half of all of the herring out of the North Sea, what would that do for all the other species which were reliant on that, either being predated upon by that species or providing food for,
Yeah, it kind of messes the ecosystem up, doesn't it?
That's what we try to avoid.
Yeah.
Humans have used the marine environment to huge. They've damaged it in some cases almost irreparably. To qualify that, the marine environment has an enormous capacity to withstand abuse.
Right.
For lack of a better word.
Right.
The same as what we do with farming on land. You can take so much out. I mean, you look at what's a good example? Amazon rainforest.
Yeah.
You can take all the forest away, but I mean, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot eventually when there's no trees left, and you have trees obviously being involved as part of the production of oxygen. And eventually we're going to end up with a reduced capacity to produce oxygen, but we'll have lots of paper. So humans are going to have to kind of weigh that one up, and the same with fisheries. For if you're taking so many fish out that it can't support itself as a population, it's going to go extinct, and you'll often hear that term used, for the dodo and dinosaurs and all those. That's already happened. If humans continue to use the world's resources. Sorry.
Are there any sort of species of fish at the moment that are kind of in the red zone where they are nearly going extinct, or their numbers are depleting, or something like that?
There are species that live in the marine environment, shall we say, that are at risk. They tend to be the things that are very high up the food web.
Right.
So they are the things that you think about, and the best example, and my colleagues would laugh at me, but dolphins, cetaceans of any kind, big stuff basically. So your whales and your sharks and things that are kind of sitting quite sort of high up in the food web. They tend to be the most susceptible. They're not necessarily targeted, but they tend to be affected by other things. So if I explain a little bit about how a food web basically works, you have what's called kind of trophic levels. So you have perhaps the primary production in a marine environment at its core, where everything comes from is phytoplankton. So think about vegetation in nature on land. You have things that feed on trees, and then you have things that feed on the things that feed on trees, and then you go up and up and up, and eventually you get to what's called your apex predator, which is actually us in the broadest possible sense. We're right at the top, because we are comparatively the fewest in number, and that's you'll often hear the food pyramid or the biomass pyramid. So you have things like phytoplankton and then zooplankton and then things that feed on them. They are hugely abundant. And then the further up you go, the less and less you have, but the bigger you have. So at the individual level, the things that are on the bottom floor of the pyramid are tiny. Tiny things that you can't even see with the naked eye. And that's what's propping up the entire planet, basically.
It always starts with the smallest things, and that just exponentially grows.
So I mean, in answer to your question, in a very roundabout way, are there any species of fish which are at risk currently? Yes. There's something called the and this is more a reference point for anybody that is listening. You have the IUCLN or IU. I can't even remember what the acronym is. Basically, it's there. If you Google Red List, you'll get to a website which has a whole pile of information about what's at risk, how much it's at risk, with the end game obviously being extinction, where the population in the wild is either completely gone, there's nothing left at all, or where it is at a level or a geographical isolation point where it cannot support itself, and basically it's kind of a ticking bomb, and eventually it will go off and there won't be any whatever species it is left, because it has either been exploited to the point of no return, or it has been forced into a kind of corner where the genetic diversity of the species is compromised. Generally, where you get that kind of condensation of the population, they become genetically very similar, and very much related to what I said earlier on about salmon escaping from a cage. Because they're genetically similar, they tend to be susceptible to the same thing. So consider human beings, because we're so diverse. If we get a flu bug, it affects everybody differently.
That's true.
If everybody was more genetically similar, that one virus could potentially wipe us all out, and that does happen.
Right.
Because we don't have that kind of survival of the fittest built
Right.
in.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I mean, the same applies to salmon escaping a cage, and I'll go back to that example. Certain viruses will just knock them out because they're not able to kind of survive at a genetic level.
Right. Okay.
Which is really interesting for me, but probably incredibly boring for everybody else. Long story short, genetic diversity is a very good thing. In fact, it's required for the long-term survivability of a species.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, I'd lose my own place, which is a general tendency for me, because I get very excited. I'm very enthusiastic. Yeah, I mean, there are certain species which are kind of at an elevated risk.
Right.
And they tend to be the ones that we're using a lot. But through the usage of schemes and certification such as the MSC,
yeah,
we hope to be able to control that. Management is absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, if you are a fish farmer or a captain of a fishing boat,
yeah,
if there are no fish, you have no business. If you have no business, you have no livelihood. If you have no livelihood, you know, you don't have a house, you don't have a car, you don't have anything at all. Life cannot exist without that. We are moving towards an entirely capitalistic kind of global economy type thing.
Yeah.
So if the fishing industry uses up all the fish that are there, then they don't have a fishing industry. So it's in their own best interest to be able to manage that effectively. Certification is a way of doing that. It's a way of making sure that you know, and historically there was kind of an unsaid rule that, well, we'll just keep using it until there's none left, and that's fine. But there's now more of a consideration made for, well, I might be fine in my lifetime, but what happens when my children kind of come into fishing? And arguably, people are now thinking, well, fishing's not going to be around. In the UK where we are, I mean, we're surrounded by sea. There's a great worry. I work very closely with a lot of fishermen, and it's a great worry that there won't be a future for their kids. That their kids who are kind of teenagers now don't want to be a part of the fishing industry because it's now perceived as a kind of a dead end.
Right.
That there's no future in it. They might enjoy it, but that they cannot see either a progression or that they see a year-on-year decline in their earnings. You know, and everybody loves to make money, but if you're making less money and there's tighter and tighter control on how much they can catch, then it's less attractive to young people, because you know that's where the world is, which ties very neatly into the sustainability thing. If we can sustain the current fishing effort, great. You know, that means that there's a future.
Yeah. Are there any steps made? Any like projections for the next decade or so in terms of changing how things are done and how the farming industry is going to move?
Absolutely. Downstream processing. So if you imagine that fish is being caught all the time and it's being sold to somebody. It's being sold to somebody, and then eventually that somebody is putting it in a box and they're selling it to the public. There is a constant shift towards, well, if you don't have that, that logo on your fish, then we're not going to buy it, and it's forcing the fishing industry into a level of management which is absolutely unprecedented, and it's a really good thing. It's slow and it's not perfect as a process, but we're moving in the right direction. It's like any resource management. It's like trees. We worked out quite quickly that there were lots of trees, and we used them for everything. We built houses and we built boats and we built everything that human society is based upon. But quite quickly we ended up kind of doing that kind of viral thing, which is to move from an area where there's lots of food and available resources to outlying areas. Yeah, and it's slightly worrying that we can't just do that. We perhaps use up all the cod, and then we go, well, scratch our heads, and we think, oh, well, if there's no cod left, or there's not much cod left, then what else can we use? And it's why you see, new things constantly in supermarkets, because if there's not much cod, then what's cheap? And then you have, and then you have that kind of, and this is not my field of expertise at all in terms of marketing. Species which are hugely abundant but are not necessarily commercially viable is, it's a huge sort of industry almost in its own right. If I said to you orange roughy, you probably never seen it.
Right.
And it's perhaps a bad example because it didn't really work, but it was throughout the 80s and 90s it was put forward as an alternative. So you have this kind of constant move between, well, if there's not much cod, then we can use herring or mackerel or haddock or whiting or saithe, or you have that kind of it's not necessarily a good thing.
That's right. It's like just like the most likely substitute, I guess.
Yeah. So and I guess the argument is that if you're using not as much cod, then cod becomes cheaper, and then you have all that kind of marketing kind of money stuff, the economic aspect to it, which is really, as I say, not my not my field of expertise. So I'll actually just leave it there because it's
That's a quite an interesting sort of thing. I mean, when you go into it and research the whole process of development and how it progresses and evolves, it's a lot of study and work involved.
Yeah.
But
it's like anything. I mean, fishing and aquaculture have a lot of resources behind them. They have a lot of money. They make a lot of money. And now that everybody can kind of see that worrying horizon, which is that, well, if we keep using it the way we have been over the last 100 years, there's not going to be anything left. We're not going to have the future.
Yeah.
So we need to invest now. And I mean, there's certain places where investment is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
They tend to be the places that are, big suppliers. Norway, Scotland, and I'm talking really.
Yeah.
I keep on kind of crossing that line, and it's because my line of work it differentiates on a very fine level. But for me, fishing and aquaculture are, I mean, they're very different, but they're very important to certain areas in the world. I mean, fishing is important to basically every area in the world. Aquaculture less so. But there are certain countries which fish more or farm more, and Scotland is hugely influential. Certainly in Europe, the largest port in the UK is Peterhead.
Oh right, okay.
Up in Aberdeenshire, and the amount of fish that goes through there every day is absolutely staggering. They've just built a new market, and very quickly the record for the new market was set at nearly 9,000 boxes of fish that went through in the space of about 3 hours.
Whoa, man, that's a lot of fish.
Yeah, I mean, bearing in mind that a box is about 20 kilos of fish, and you got 9,000 boxes in 3 hours. It's a lot of fish. And what's even more staggering is that happens every day.
Wow.
Monday, Tuesday, and has one port in one country. And if you put it in that perspective, you think, geez, how can the planet support that kind of...
That's crazy. That's absolute crazy. That's a lot of fish.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy. And every country's doing that. And Scotland, in the global sense, is tiny. It is very, very small. The most, how to phrase this, the most utilized wild stock is the South American anchovy, I think.
Okay.
In fact, more specifically, I think it's either the Chilean or the Ecuadorian stock, and the numbers involved would make your eyes water.
Wow.
It's just staggering that the sea can actually produce that every year, and it's not a really, with clever management, that number will never go down.
That's crazy. And now with pollution and all of that, how it is affecting the ocean and the whole food system, that could really cut the numbers down.
Absolutely, and only through the usage of management tools like certification. It's me kind of singing the praises of certification again. I mean, at a governmental level, there is a hugely advanced and sort of highly controlled. In a national government, you have almost in every case some departmental control of fisheries, and in Europe you have all the member states of Europe. It's a very interesting question actually, because the UK is obviously leaving Europe soon. You have what's called the CFP, or the Common Fisheries Policy, which is that we've got certain bodies of water which are used by multiple countries. So if you think about the geography of the North Sea, you have the UK on one side, and then you have France and the Netherlands, Germany, and then Denmark, and then Norway, all kind of looking in on the same body of water. It's a very complex management structure behind that, based on the principle that there's X amount of fish in that body of water. How do you then allocate the amount of fish that every country can take?
That's right. I think it's pretty much the same as the drilling for oil, basically in the North Sea. They have sort of like a grid system, like a sector where each country has a certain allocation of area to use.
Definitely, but the real complexity comes from a lot of things actually. But the primary one is that you have a resource which moves. Oil doesn't move, at least on a human scale. So where that resource is, it basically sits. It's like a forest. It's not going to move. On a scale that is perceptible by humans. Fish, on the other hand, or I don't know, cephalopods, squid, anything that you're taking out of the marine environment is subject to movement generally, unless it's seaweed, and that's a whole other conversation. But that you have for example, if you have a huge shoal of herring, they are, broadly speaking, migratory species. They like to move around. Some of that is dependent on, in fact, it's largely dependent on the water temperature. So whatever they're feeding on will tend to be in certain places and not in others. They have a kind of seasonal migration pattern, so you can, broadly speaking, predict where they're going to be. If for whatever reason on a 10-year cycle the water in the west of the North Sea is very warm, chances are the herring are going to be over there and not on the eastern fringe. So that would favour the UK.
Right. Okay.
How do you, if all of the fish move into British territorial waters, well, what does everybody else do? What happens to their entitlement? And that's where you get into the real difficulty. And it's why they developed the Common Fisheries Policy, which was to kind of get around some of that awkward management. That happens on a national scale, on an international scale, and it's really complicated, and it's not perfect. It's based on science, and scientists are often wrong. There is a level of involvement from, like you say, corporations and big entities which have shall we say, an influence on governmental matters, which is unwholesome,
Right.
Which is not fair,
Right.
and is not, in my mind anyway, ethical.
Right.
And that's going to come up a few times. It's probably the kind of unofficial theme of this is, yeah, it's unethical, which is why you have people that step in. And again, this is me kind of supporting my own company. So the company I work for is what's called a third party. In terms of the decision it's making is absolute at the core of that decision making process, which is to say, yes, it is sustainable and it is responsibly done. At the core of that is our impartiality. So we stand out there and we are ourselves the subject of much investigation to make sure that every decision that we make is impartial, that it is not biased, it is not affected by, whether we're getting a bribe here and there. These things do exist, and it's not good, and it's not to be kind of endorsed in any way.
Yeah.
I think maybe the example you're thinking about, the sugar industry, I think that's perhaps in the past, but a lot of money changes hands, and it's not all done in plain sight. There are unscrupulous fishermen who,
Right.
for example, land fish that they are not perhaps either certified to land, or that they are landing over quota. Now, quota is not quota is not something that I've mentioned, but the broad understanding is, and the principle behind it is that at a national level, fishermen are granted a quota. They are allowed to catch a certain amount of fish, or they are allowed to. It's a way of controlling a fishing effort. So there's lots of different ways you can do it, but the most common example is that they are allowed to catch a certain amount of fish in a given period of time.
Right.
That said, people manipulate that. People land fish that they don't have on the books. They don't tell anybody about. You'll hear the term in the media, blackfish.
Right.
So blackfish is it's not a species of fish. It's fish that doesn't really appear anywhere in terms of.
All right.
So you have a quota for 20,000 tons in a year, and that's great, and you land 50,000 tons, but you only write in the book 20,000 tons.
All right. Okay. It's pretty sneaky.
Oh, it's very sneaky, and it's been around for a very long time, and ultimately it'll probably continue. It can be reduced to an absolute minimum, but fishermen are clever, same as all humans in all industries. They will work out ways of getting around that, and part of the certification process is understanding what the risks are involved, and also because you're ultimately kind of trying to make sure that they're playing to the rules, you're looking at how they're landing fish. So you would maybe go down to the harbour and have a look at what was in the boxes. If he says that he has in his box 20 kilos of fish, and he has a sticker on it and it has an MSC logo on it, you assume that that box has 20 kilos in it. If it has 40 kilos in it, and he says it's 20 kilos, then legally he's doing absolutely the right thing. But then when he sells it, he's going to get double the money. That makes sense?
Right. Okay.
It's a pretty blunt example, but it probably makes sense. It's quite difficult. I must admit, it's quite difficult for me to talk about this. Because it's very well. It's not easy for me to understand, but it's easier, shall we say?
Yeah. So is anyone regulating this, or looking into this, or trying to make it?
Absolutely. It is very tightly controlled. You have people like us that go around and they're looking at landings. You have non-governmental organisations which are looking at landings. You have governmental organisations which are looking at landings. In Scotland, it's an organisation called Marine Scotland Science, who are based in Aberdeen.
Yeah.
And they have basically either a direct employee or somebody that is kind of subcontracted to go down to the markets and go, hello, Captain Skipper. I see that on paper you're landing 500 boxes today. I'd like to have a look at the fish, make sure that the fish that you say, are actually the fish that you're landing, and also that the weights and certain other things are what you say, and these things can be pre-planned.
Right.
It can be, I'm going to come out and have a look at your boat, but more often than not, it is unplanned and unannounced. And it's like an inspection for anything, really. It's much better if you can prove that you are sticking to the rule book, if you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
Because if you know what's going to happen, then you can prepare and you can hide the fish that you're not supposed to be doing whatever with. So yeah, I mean, it's really, really tightly controlled, which is good.
Because most people don't understand how the fishing industry works and how all these protocols and regulations come into effect. It's just crazy.
No, I mean back in I don't know, dozen centuries, millennia ago, you could do whatever you wanted. You could get a boat and you could get your family involved, and you could go out and catch as much fish as you wanted, and nobody. The only limit was how many hours you could work in a day, or how big your boat was, or how fast your engine was. The boats that were fishing for cod and stuff in the North Atlantic in America, they were basically racing yachts at a certain point.
Wow.
Because the idea was that if you went out and caught fish, if you got back very, very quickly, you could set the market because there wasn't any fish on the market, and you could charge whatever you wanted. If everybody arrived back at the same time, the market was flooded and the price would drop through the floor.
Wow.
So what they were doing is they were going out in boats that weren't particularly stable. They were getting as much fish as they could, and they were racing back to harbour. And to be there first was great, because if there was no fish on the market, then people that wanted to buy the fish had to buy your fish.
Right.
And the knock-on to that was that these boats weren't particularly seaworthy. They weren't particularly safe, and loads of boats were lost and lots of lives were lost, which was terrible. But when there's money involved, people are prepared to take risks.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen to the same extent anymore. There's a lot more kind of concern given to, and it's again tied into what I do, which is providing an assurance that the crew are safe, that they are looked after, they have contracts, or they have at least a work agreement that, we're very much anti-slavery. I work with a scheme called Responsible Fishing, which a huge component of is that the crew are looked after, that they are given a safe working environment, that they are contractually not slaves, that they are not chained to the deck.
Yeah.
And it's terribly sad, but even in the UK and at least in the Western world, modern slavery exists. And standards exist, or at least parts of standards exist, to try and stamp that out, to try and remove that, so that people, when they work in the fishing industry, are not at risk of being abused or taken advantage of, that they are going out risking their lives, and that they are not paid a commensurate salary, so a salary which was equivalent to somebody that was working on land. I mean, there are lots of problems with fishing boats, in that what happens at sea generally stays at sea.
That's true.
because it's far away and it happens miles from land, and nobody. It doesn't have the level of scrutiny, or at least historically, it doesn't have the level of scrutiny that stuff on land has. Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting now is that there aren't really. I mean, we're at almost maximum kind of exploitation levels for lots of species, pretty much all species actually. So that's the level at which you can safely and sustainably, and again, I'll use that word again, it's because it's my favorite word, that you can sustainably use that resource. So you have a population of whatever species you're utilizing, that you're removing from the environment. That population will have a set number that every year it can kind of make more. So it's a bit like a crop. You can harvest your potatoes or your whatever. No, in fact, a better example would be I don't know. It is very much like a crop.
Yeah.
You're harvesting it, but you don't want to take it to the point where there's nothing left, because if there's nothing left, you don't have a crop.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that I don't really know where I'm going with this conversation, but I guess I'm happy with what I'm doing. I think I mentioned earlier on that I was seen to be a bit of a Judas to my colleagues, to the people that I went to university with, because a lot of them had problems with the way that I kind of approach my work. But the problem is, if we accept that sustainability is going to be a continual issue with humans living on planet Earth, and to my mind it is. We live on planet Earth. We are using what planet Earth has and what planet Earth creates for us. We need to have a level of control, and we need to have a level of control that provides sustainability, so that in 100 years' time we are still able to do what we're doing, because otherwise it will involve a sort of a massive shift in what we do and what we exploit. So a lot of people are saying things like, well, eventually there'll be no more fish left, so we'll have to all eat fungus or things that are growing in laboratories. And this has been kind of explored laboriously in media, in films. It's a film which comes to mind called Soylent Green, where I think people are at a point where planet Earth can't support the human population, so I think they end up cannibalizing. They end up like killing people when they reach 50 years old,
right?
And they convert that resource into food for the rest. And it's a deep dark secret, and there's revelation partway through the film.
Really? Well, hopefully
people find out what Soylent Green is, and Soylent Green is a euphemism for dead people.
Wow.
And that's one possible future where we reach that point where every environment has what's called a carrying capacity, which is the natural kind of resilience of a population. Arguably, humans are outside of that because we are clever. We're not monkeys. I personally see humans as just very advanced monkeys. I still see us as animals. I don't see us as something it's really special. I'm not religious. I don't buy into that whole soul thing. I don't know. I mean, like I said right at the start of the conversation, I came from a very religious background. Not necessarily my family unit, but certainly where I grew up was very religious, and it was kind of drummed into me that this was this was law. I mean, it wasn't even just it was just the way things were. It was it possibly had a polar effect on me. It probably galvanized me against it, and it made me I'm not going to say a better scientist, because ultimately a scientist's job is to answer questions, but it's also to pose questions.
Absolutely,
so we're asking questions, and we're thinking of questions constantly, and some questions are more, they have more tangible real life applications. Some aren't. Some are just kind of fact, and eventually they might have a use, but a lot of research is just numbers and figures, and if it's a species which isn't directly related to humans, people often struggle to see, well, what the hell's the point? Why are we doing this? I am a huge fan of the exact opposite. Whatever I do, I tend to try and make it's probably slightly egotistical, but make important.
Right.
I like to think it has a point, because if it
Yeah.
doesn't have a point, well,
Uh-huh.
what's the point?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, that's the whole point of species, right? On the planet. I mean, it's all about procreation. I mean, that's the biological function of any sort of multicellular organism.
Yes, I mean this is probably like borderline into another conversation, but yeah, I mean if you look at humans in that sense, yeah, absolutely, it's all about procreation. It's about the sustainability of the species, and we are a species. Homo sapiens is our Latin name, and we are the evolution of primordial man. Back to the cradle of life in Africa.
That's right.
That's where they tell us we're all from.
Yeah.
No, totally. And then you're into empiricism, where it's not. I don't believe it unless I can prove it with my own two hands, type thing.
That's true.
Scientists have a lot to answer for,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, there's a lot of trust involved in what scientists say. And as I said earlier on, scientists are quite often completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're a scientist doesn't necessarily make you. It doesn't give you it shouldn't give you a god complex. It shouldn't make, because I'm a scientist and I do lots of research and I record lots of numbers, it shouldn't give you the right to consider yourself always right, because the reality is that scientists are often wrong.
Yeah.
We like to think that in the best possible sense we are wrong less often than somebody that's not a scientist.
Right.
But we're only going to get the answer to questions by what's the phrase? You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. You can't learn things effectively without doing stuff wrong. We learn by our mistakes, and it's a bit sad, but sometimes we get that so fundamentally wrong that the mistake that we make means that we can't then fix it.
Yeah.
But I think this is where my conversation is probably going to end. Where we are with fisheries and with aquaculture. Mm-hmm. Aquaculture is not so good an example because it doesn't have the history.
Yeah.
But if we use fishing, we realised that things were going totally wrong when we started running out of fish. For some species, I don't know. It's right. Too. We may end up losing some species over, not necessarily even my lifetime, but beyond, because the population worldwide is now at a point where it maybe can't.
Right.
Survive. But if we are aware of the mistakes that we're making through various means, through the fact that fishermen aren't catching as much fish, I mean that's the most simplistic way that we know that things are potentially going wrong.
Yeah.
There's no fish. Well, something must be wrong. That's not necessarily true. It may just be that the fish are on a sort of natural cycle of not being around. The species I have a sort of very strong affinity for, mackerel.
Yeah.
I like catching mackerel, I like eating mackerel. I think they're beautiful fish. I think they're fascinating. They like to go into deep water or deeper water during the winter months, and they kind of don't do much. They more or less kind of hibernate.
Right. Okay.
So they stop feeding, and they just kind of do their own thing. And then in the warmer summer months, they come into shallower water, which is warmer, and there's a very strong relationship there. And when the water's warmer, you have loads of food. Yeah. So they get fat over summer. So there's a seasonal fishery for mackerel. There's also a winter fishery, but maybe a different boat would be targeting it. So your inshore fleet would be targeting the mackerel in the summer months, and then your offshore fleet would be targeting mackerel in the winter months.
Right.
And we're only going to understand these things by putting money into research and employing people like me.
So,
I have lots of opinions. I mean, I'd be the first one to put up my hand and say that I'm not a genius. I'm not technically even really a scientist anymore.
Right.
I have perhaps a slightly different view to most people. It's probably a broader view because I've done lots of different things. And
right.
I've been a consumer. I am a consumer as well. I like eating fish.
Yep.
I've also worked in processing. I was a professional villager of salmon. I was the manager of a harvest facility.
Right. Okay.
For salmon, so I was working on cages part of my time. What else have I done? I've worked for a freshwater fisheries trust. I have a license to electrofish, which is a way of measuring the amount of fish that live in the river.
Yeah.
But use of electricity, which is really, really interesting, but probably not for this conversation. Yeah, basically, we're only going to learn things that we can use by putting resources into research. And just kind of continuing what humans are built to do, which is to ask questions and learn to understand things.
Yeah, that's right. Seamus, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I mean, it's really good and very informative, and it's a pleasure to have you. And
it would have been a lot better if I'd been talking about one specific thing. I tend to get really excited and then kind of talk about lots of different things. So I apologize for the lack of focus.
That's fine. I mean, next time we can expand on other stuff. Yeah. Well, that's it for today, and join us next time for another interesting podcast. And I shall see you next time. Thanks, Seamus.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thank
you for being patient.
Cheers, bye.
Cheers. Bye.